The HOA in Oakwood thought they were untouchable, fining families, pocketing money, and threatening anyone who spoke against them. They acted like the law didn't apply within their gates. But what they didn't realize was that justice was closer than they imagined. When they pushed too far and tried bullying the wrong homeowner, they unknowingly crossed paths with someone who had the law on his side. His brother was the county sheriff. And this time, the sheriff wasn't backing down. I never wanted trouble when I moved into Oakwood Estates. The neighborhood appeared peaceful, with well-maintained lawns, charming houses, and a welcoming atmosphere. But behind that polished surface, a corrupt HOA board pulled the strings. They weren't just enforcing rules, they were lining their own pockets. At first, I thought the notices in my mailbox were just standard reminders. A fine here, a warning there. But then I started talking to neighbors, and the truth came out: the board was systematically abusing its power. It began with small infractions. A $50 fine for leaving my trash invisible for too long. A $75 charge for grass they claimed was slightly uneven. When I asked where the money went, they said it went toward community improvements. But no one had ever seen these so-called improvements. Streets weren't repaved, lights weren't replaced, and community spaces were neglected. Everyone whispered about the president of the board, Mr. Harlan, a smug man with a smile that never reached his eyes. He and his cronies treated Oakwood like their personal piggy bank. One evening, at a neighbor's barbecue, I learned just how deep the corruption went. An elderly resident named Linda confided in me, her voice shaking. They fined me $500 for painting my shutters the wrong shade of blue. I checked the bylaws myself, there's no rule about shutter colors. But they threatened to put a lien on my house if I didn't pay. My stomach turned. Another neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, added, "They've been doing this for years. Everyone's too scared to fight them. They say if you push back, they'll make your life a nightmare." That was the HOA's power, intimidation. They created fear and thrived on silence. But I wasn't the type to sit quietly, especially not when people were being exploited. What the board didn't know was that my brother, Daniel, was the county sheriff. He wasn't just a man with a badge, he was respected, fair, and deeply protective of the people in his jurisdiction. I hadn't planned to involve him, but as the harassment grew worse, I realized this battle needed someone with real authority. The final straw came when I received a letter demanding $1,200 in special assessment fees. The reason? Alleged security upgrades that no one had approved or seen. When I asked to see the financial records, the HOA flatly refused. "That information is board confidential," Mr. Harlan sneered at the next meeting. "If you don't like it, you're free to sell your house." His arrogance lit a fire in me. I wasn't about to be bullied out of my own home. That night, I called Daniel. "I didn't want to drag you into this," I told him, "but something's really wrong here." I explained everything: the bogus fines, the intimidation, the missing money. He listened carefully, asking questions, jotting notes. Finally, he said, "I've heard whispers about Oakwood's HOA before. You're not the first person to complain, but no one's ever brought solid evidence. If what you're telling me is true, this isn't just bullying, it's fraud." Daniel had always been calm, deliberate, and measured. If he said it was serious, then it was. Together, we came up with a plan. My job was to keep collecting proof, letters, receipts, testimonies from neighbors. His job was to quietly investigate without tipping off the board. It wouldn't be easy, but the board had grown sloppy in their greed. They thought no one dared challenge them. They were wrong. Over the next few weeks, I started documenting everything. Every notice that landed in my mailbox went into a folder. I wrote down every conversation I had with a neighbor. People were surprisingly eager to talk once they realized someone was finally standing up. Linda gave me copies of her bogus shutter fine. Mr. Alvarez handed over records of repeated late fees that appeared even after he paid on time. A young couple showed me an email where the board threatened foreclosure over a missed $100 payment, a scare tactic that was completely illegal. The folder grew thicker and thicker until it was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Daniel began digging into public records. He checked the HOA's filed budgets and compared them to actual community spending. The numbers didn't add up. Thousands of dollars collected in fees were unaccounted for. Vendors supposedly hired for landscaping or security had no records of contracts. It was a paper trail of corruption hiding in plain sight. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became. The board wasn't just abusing power, they were stealing. But exposing them wouldn't be as simple as walking into a meeting with a stack of papers. Corruption this entrenched meant they would fight back hard. They thrived on intimidation, and if they suspected we were onto them, they'd retaliate. I saw it firsthand one afternoon when I caught Mr. Harlan glaring at me from his car as I walked to get the mail. The next day, I found a notice claiming I had violated landscaping rules by having unauthorized shrubs. It was laughable, but it was also a warning. They knew I was a problem, and they intended to make me pay. I wasn't scared, though. I was motivated. Every bogus notice only added fuel to the fire. I shared updates with Daniel, and he kept building the case quietly. Don't confront them directly yet, he advised. The more rope they give us, the harder they'll hang themselves. It wasn't just about protecting myself anymore, it was about standing up for every family in Oakwood who had been bullied into silence. The tension came to a head at the next HOA meeting. The clubhouse was packed, more residents than I'd ever seen before. People were restless, fed up, and looking for answers. Mr. Harlan stood at the front, smug as ever, announcing yet another round of special assessments. That's when I stood up. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady. Before you ask us for more money, I said, why don't you show us where the last money went? The room went silent. All eyes turned to me. Harlan's smirk faltered for the first time. That information is board confidential, he repeated. But this time, the crowd didn't stay quiet. Neighbors started murmuring, some shouting, we have the right to know. The board tried to regain control, but the atmosphere had shifted. For the first time, the residents weren't afraid, they were angry. Harlan banged his gavel, threatening fines and penalties for disruption. But it was too late. The seed had been planted. People realized they weren't alone. The board's power came from fear, and fear was crumbling. That night, after the meeting, I handed Daniel the thick folder I had compiled. This is everything, I told him. He flipped through the pages, his expression hardening. This isn't just HOA nonsense, he said finally. This is criminal. Fraud, embezzlement, harassment. They've crossed every line. He closed the folder and looked me in the eye. It's time to shut them down. The HOA boardroom smelled of expensive leather and arrogance when Sheriff Daniels walked in with me. The board members had gathered in their usual smug fashion, papers and laptops spread across a polished mahogany table. Their leader, Harold Baines, the HOA president, looked up with a sneer when he saw me enter with the sheriff. Well, if it isn't the troublemaker and his pet lawman," Baines drawled, folding his hands. "What is this? Some sort of intimidation tactic?" The sheriff didn't flinch. He stepped forward, boots heavy on the floor, his badge catching the overhead light. "No intimidation here, Mr. Baines," Daniels said calmly. "Just a lawful visit. We've had complaints, serious ones, about mismanagement of HOA funds, harassment of residents, and abuse of authority." Gasps rippled across the room. One of the board members, a nervous woman with glasses, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Another, a man with slicked back hair, started scribbling furiously on his notepad. Baines waved a dismissive hand. "Complaints? Sheriff, this is a homeowners association, not some backroom gambling ring. We're just volunteers keeping the neighborhood orderly. If a few residents don't like rules, that's their problem." I stepped forward then, my voice steady. "Rules are one thing. Extortion is another. You tried to fine me $5,000 for painting my shutters navy blue instead of approved dark green. You demanded monthly maintenance fees that never went into any neighborhood service. And you threatened to seize my property if I didn't comply." The sheriff laid a folder on the table with a heavy thud. "And I've got documented proof for more than a dozen homeowners saying the same. False fines. Misuse of HOA funds. Harassment." For the first time, Baines' smirk faltered. The crack in the armor of the boardroom erupted into bickering. "You told us those extra fees were legal," the nervous woman hissed at Baines. "They are," he snapped back. "No, they're not," the sheriff interrupted firmly. "You've been running this HOA like it's your personal piggy bank." Daniels began pulling out evidence, bank statements showing HOA funds mysteriously transferred to a private account in Baines' name, emails where board members mocked homeowners who dared to question them, and even records of intimidation tactics. My stomach churned as I listened. I'd always suspected corruption, but hearing it laid out was another thing entirely. "This is outrageous," Baines finally thundered, his face red. "Sheriff, you're overstepping your jurisdiction. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one." Daniels fixed him with a cold stare. "Fraud is very much a criminal matter. And as of right now, this board is under investigation." The room fell silent. PowerShift's word spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. By the end of the week, half the community had gathered in the clubhouse for an emergency meeting, this time without Baines' permission. I stood in the back as residents took turns sharing their stories. One elderly woman, Mrs. Patterson, shook as she held up letters she'd received from the HOA demanding payment for illegal bird feeders. Another resident revealed that the HOA had threatened foreclosure unless he replaced his roof immediately, even though it was only 5 years old. The anger in the room was palpable. People who had been afraid to speak now found courage knowing the sheriff was on their side. Daniels addressed the crowd. "I've officially suspended all HOA board operations pending investigation. No more fines. No more harassment. No more threats. The days of corruption here are over. Cheers erupted. Neighbors hugged one another. For the first time in months, I felt hope instead of dread. But Baines wasn't done. The last stand the very next morning, I woke to find a letter taped to my door. Sheriff Daniels has no authority over the HOA. All residents must continue paying fines and fees as usual. Failure to comply will result in property seizure. At the bottom, Baines had signed it with a flourish. My blood boiled. Did this man not understand that the walls were closing in? I immediately took the letter to Daniels. "This," he said, holding it up with disgust, "is the final nail in his coffin. He just attempted to enforce fines under investigation. That's obstruction and fraud." That afternoon, patrol cars rolled into the neighborhood. Daniels led the charge as officers marched straight into Baines' home office. Within minutes, they emerged with boxes of files, hard drives, and evidence. And then, in front of the entire neighborhood that had gathered on their lawns, Harold Baines was led out in handcuffs. His face was a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You can't do this. I own this neighborhood," he screamed. Daniels leaned close and said calmly, "No, Harold. You just ruined your own life." Justice restored. In the weeks that followed, things began to change. The corrupt board was officially dissolved. An interim committee of residents, honest, hard-working people, was formed to manage neighborhood matters until proper elections could be held. The stolen funds were tracked down, and restitution was ordered. Every dollar that had been pocketed was returned to the HOA account, and from there, redistributed fairly. But more than the money, it was the atmosphere that changed. Neighbors waved to one another again. The constant fear of harassment lifted. Families could decorate, plant, and live freely without worrying about arbitrary fines. One evening, as I stood on my porch watching kids ride bikes down the street, Sheriff Daniels stopped by. "Not bad, huh?" he said, nodding at the lively neighborhood. "Not bad at all," I agreed. "I never thought I'd see the day." He smiled. "You stood up when most people were scared. That's what made the difference." I shook my head. "We all stood up. Together. That's why it worked." Epilogue. The real victory. Months later, the HOA held its first Democratic election in years. I wasn't planning to run, but my neighbors insisted. "After what you did, you're the only one we trust," Mrs. Patterson told me with tears in her eyes. I accepted, not because I wanted power, but because I wanted to make sure the board never fell back into corrupt hands again. On election day, the clubhouse was packed. Votes were cast, counted, and announced. I had been chosen as the new HOA president. But unlike Baines, I didn't see it as a crown. I saw it as a responsibility. The first motion I passed? A complete rewrite of the HOA charter to ensure transparency, accountability, and resident rights. No more unchecked power. No more backroom deals. The sheriff attended the meeting, leaning against the back wall with his usual quiet pride. When it was over, he tipped his hat at me and left without a word. And just like that, our neighborhood was finally free. If you enjoyed this story of standing up to corruption and watching justice finally win, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We bring you powerful stories like this every week, full of drama, twists, and satisfying revenge. Don't miss the next one. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our growing community of viewers who love seeing HOA bullies get exactly what they deserve.